Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the Role of Executive Functions in Learning to Write and Written Expression webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach the operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, February 28, 2013. I would now like to turn the conference over to Andrea Moss. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We know it's been a busy week of webinars, especially for you in the schools. We know it's tough for you to take some time during your day, so we really appreciate your participation. As Dr. McCloskey is speaking this morning, if you have a question, please use the chat box, and we'll try to save a few minutes at the end to address those today. Now I'm excited to introduce Dr. George McCloskey. He's a professor and director of school psychology research in the psychology department of the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. He frequently presents at national, regional, and state meetings on cognitive and neuropsychological assessment and intervention topics. Dr. McCloskey consults with a number of school districts and private schools in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and California on issues related to improving students' self-regulation capacities in the classroom, behavior management, assessment and intervention for executive function difficulties related to academic and behavior problems, balanced literacy reading and writing instruction, and implementation of RTI. He is the lead author of Assessment and Intervention for Executive Function Difficulties and author of Essentials of Executive Functions Assessment. Dr. McCloskey has also been involved in test development and publishing activities for more than 25 years. He directed the development of the WISC-IV Integrative and was a senior research director and a clinical advisor to the Wechsler Test Development Group for the Psychological Corporation, which is now part of Pearson, and associate director of test development for AGS, which is also now part of Pearson. Dr. McCloskey, we welcome you, and you can begin once you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. I appreciate it. Hello, folks. We have about 90 minutes, so grab your preferred caffeinated beverage and strap yourself in here. Let's see. We're going to talk about executive functions today and written expression, and we just want to let you know that we have a couple sources here of information that we're going to focus on primarily, and I've borrowed very heavily from Virginia Bernier's Brain Literacy for Educators and Psychologists for the basis of neuropsychological basis of writing. And I have quite a bit of information on assessment of executive functions for written expression and other academic areas in the Essentials of Executive Function Assessment. So those are two sources that I'll be drawing from today as we talk. Initially here, when take a look here, Virginia Bernier talks about the different processes here of the use of language by the brain, and she discusses language by ear, which is listening, by mouth speaking, by eye reading. What we want to talk about today is the complicated process of language by hand, which involves writing, and how the motor cortex syncs up with the language centers of the brain to produce our writing, a very complicated process. That language by hand develops over a much longer developmental trajectory than the other language systems, and it requires the greatest involvement in frontal lobe function. So we're really looking here at one of the most complex things that the human brain does. We've had language for, potentially 50,000 years, roughly speaking. We've only been writing for less than 10,000. So, this is a new thing for the brain to do, to coordinate all these different areas of the brain into the process of writing, which is one of the reasons why it's so complicated, hard for kids to do, and also why there's so much executive function involvement with it. It's important to remember that writing is not the mirror image of reading. It's more difficult. Spelling is more difficult than reading because of the different ways that the sounds can be represented. So it's a bit more challenging in terms of the phonological components and the orthographic components that are involved here. And it's not really a writing act, and we need to remember that handwriting, spelling, and the act of composition, or writing sentences and essays and paragraphs, are really differentially supported systems, and they can be dissociable. And so we need to look at those aspects of writing separately and assess them separately whenever possible. With the concept of executive functions here, just a little background here on basic concepts that we need to understand writing as a process so that we can get into the executive function component. Now, we don't have time to talk about these in detail, so I just want to familiarize you with a couple of the terms that we'll be using: processes, abilities, skills, lexicons. Lexicons are stored knowledge bases, the information that you have. So when you, as a writer, if you want to write about a topic, you need to have background knowledge. That would be a stored information center, and so we're looking there to call those lexicons. Abilities are the things like reasoning and language ability that you bring in, also visual spatial, the translation of language, or translation of language into visual spatial coordinates. When someone reads what you write, would they understand, would they have a visual image in their mind? So that's visual spatial translation of language. These are abilities we draw on. And the basic processes of taking information in from the environment are important here. But that doesn't start until the writing process begins when you move your hand. And then the actual processing occurs in what you see on the page and what you take in for purposes of editing and revising. Then we have executive functions that cue and direct all these strategies, or some combination of processes, abilities, skills, lexicons that we use to get the job done or make it easier for us to do. I think I skipped skills, which are what we teach in terms of how to write. The actual education of the writing process would be called skills. And then achievement is the sum total of all these. So in the next slide, we've just got a visual here, and I see that I don't have interactive potential here for layered slides for animation. Okay, so we're just going to be looking at some of these just the way they're presented here. Basically, we have processes, skills, abilities, lexicons, strategies, all combined, and that's what produces achievement. So basically, when we talk about achievement, that's a very global concept, and the difficulty with referring to the term achievement is that when we are assessing an individual, we don't know which of these components is producing the difficulty if you have difficulties with achievement. If you have low achievement scores, it could be due to any of these abilities, skills, lexicons, processes, lack of strategies, and the memory time frames in which you need to hold information and process it, immediate memory, working memory, retrieval from long-term storage. Any of those could be the problem in the process of writing. So a good comprehensive assessment of writing skills or writing abilities is going to require us to look at all of these potentially and figure out where the problem is. In terms of an overall model of writing, you have one here. I like to layer this in one at a time, but we're going to have to look at this all at once. Basically, what we're looking at here in the act of writing, it's a little different than others, and really the act of writing starts in the brain with the idea and the generation of an idea. That's that first box up there, or second box in the second line. So idea generation is what begins the process. You have to apply language to the idea. In order to apply language to the idea, you have to have words. You need to know words. You're not going to write words you don't know. So your semantic lexicon, your knowledge of words, what they mean, and your pronunciation lexicon, have you ever heard them spoken? Would you even use them in the first place? Those are all critical pieces of the writing process. Any knowledge that you have about the topic is going to have to come in at that point in time. If you want to present it in a way that enables other people to see what you're talking about, visual spatial capacities will have to be used. If you're going to present an argument, reasoning would have to be used. So you're thinking about all this in your head. All of this has to occur in the presence of working memory. That's the green box there. You're using working memory to hold these ideas and process them. All that needs to occur in the head before the pencil is even picked up. So the act of writing is it's a very complicated process that starts far before we can observe anything of what a child does for us. And this is important to remember, because when teaching writing, it's often kind of not carefully understood or effectively understood that all this has to happen in the head, and you've got to explain this to a child in terms of how to get this process started and how to do it before you pick up the pencil. Once you pick up the pencil, you're using graphomotor functioning to write your words and write sentences, and that requires some visual spatial processing in terms of where you place the letters on the page, how closely you place them, whether you leave spaces between words, all the things that we do to format the letters we place on the page so other people can read them and they're legible. The orthographic component is the actual knowledge of letters and the shapes that letters occur in, and then the graphomotor component is producing those shapes. And of course, phonologically, if you are trying to write and you're not sure how to spell a word, if you want to try to spell a word that you possibly don't know or aren't that familiar with, processing to guide the orthographic production of what it is that you want to write. So all those components are involved. In the middle is what we teach, which is text generation, transcription, spelling, automaticity of all these components, and editing and revising. These are all critical skills that we need to teach, but you can see all the other components. And I'm sorry, moving back on that slide for 1 second then. Executive functions in this particular model of writing are everywhere you see red arrows in this model, which means that there's a lot of cueing, coordinating, and directing that executive functions have to do in the writing process, because it's involved in all these components and integrating all these components in order to get writing done. So you can see we've got a pretty complex system to drive here in terms of what we want to do with writing. Okay, next slide. There we go. Okay, so just there, I'm not going to talk about these at length, but just some of the knowledge stores, the lexicons that we need for writing are there. Also, we have the abilities we just mentioned and the processes and processing and functioning that has to occur, and then the time frames of reference. We just mentioned those in that model that you just saw. And as I said, we don't have a lot of time to go into these. These are the skills that we teach: handwriting, spelling, converting ideas to words, composition, writing sentences, paragraphs, essays, editing, and revising words, sentences, paragraphs, and essays. These are the things that we teach and then draw on all those components that we just saw in terms of the writing process. The writing process is holarchically organized, and so it's important to think about a hierarchy or a holarchy instead of a hierarchy. You look at the next slide here. A hierarchy is where you go step by step, and you don't move to the next step until you have mastered the previous step. So it's very lockstep, and you move through it one at a time, and you cannot move ahead until you have finished one stage. In writing, that's not the case. We begin the writing process, then we can, and the writing process starts with an idea. You can move forward with a bad idea, and then the next stage kicks in, and you have to represent that idea with language. You may be poor at that. The next step is to generate text and put something on the page. And then the last one is editing and revising. So in writing, it's critical to understand that you will move through these stages of the process. You're not going to stay at idea generation until you have the perfect idea. You may have a bad idea, and you can move forward into language representation. You may have not very good language to represent the idea and move into generating text using your text transcription skills. And then if it's really bad, you can still move on to edit and revising, and that's where you can really do a good job of fixing it up. So this whole process of writing is holarchically organized rather than hierarchy, but this is how it works. Virginia Bernier would talk about this as what I say, or what I think I can say, what I say I can write, and I would add what I write I can fix up. And that would be the stages of writing that we're teaching from kindergarten through the graduate level in education. And then planning and organization can occur at any point in this process. You can stop to plan or organize. Some people kind of have the idea that all the planning has to occur before you start writing, which isn't necessarily the case. A lot of good planning can occur once the text has been generated. But we do have to get into some planning and organization as you become a more competent writer. So we're converting ideas to words, and then we're using handwriting and spelling to create composition, and then we're editing and revising. These are the stages that we're looking at in writing. Let's just take a look here at how the brain is functioning in certain situations with different tasks. So this is going to reflect a little bit on what we have to do with executive functions for writing. These are PET scan images of an individual attempting a task that at first requires some executive function to perform. So that far left image there with the red, yellow, and green lit up that's the parts of the frontal lobe that are being involved in an individual understanding what to do for a task. And the task is, when you see a noun on the screen, provide a verb. And so we're looking at rapid verb generation. 40 nouns are presented on the screen, 1 per second, and the person has to give a verb that goes with each of these nouns. So with this rapid verb generation task, initially, if you're not used to doing these kinds of tasks, it takes a great deal of executive functions to figure out what to do, how to do it, and how to run your show while you're doing it. Now, when doing this, they kind of screwed up with one of the subjects they were looking at, and so they reran it very quickly, and they were stunned at what they found. So they created a different condition of the experiment, which is the practice condition. In the practice condition, they gave the people all 40 of the words, the nouns, and had them write verbs that would go with each. And then based on what they wrote, they wanted to memorize the relationship between the noun and the verb. Then they scanned their brains and showed them the nouns and asked them to give them the verbs that they had rehearsed. And now we see in practice situations like that, you see very little involvement in the frontal lobe, just a little bit of purple there, which suggests there's very minimal involvement of executive control in performing this task because you already know, the person who's doing this already knew what they were going to say. So when you have automated a task or practiced at that point, you require very little in the way of frontal lobe function. Now, if you receive the task again, but it's the same task with different items, that's that novel condition, the third one there, and you can see a reactivation of the frontal lobe. So in some situations, you've got some of it that you are familiar with now. I know, generally speaking, how to do this task, but I don't know the specific requirements of these items, and so there's a reactivation of the frontal lobes to make some decisions about that. In the writing process, this would be, akin to when you're first learning how to write. You don't know how to do it. So there's a lot of executive functions involved, especially in graphomotor production. Just learning how to make the letters requires a lot of frontal lobe functions initially for students to just generate the letters. Now, once they have practiced their letters to automaticity, you're looking at that middle screen where there's minimal frontal lobe involvement when you are producing and when you're handwriting, when you know how to form the letters, and especially when you know how to form the letters and know how to spell. Once you've automated graphomotor production and spelling, now you are free to write what you are thinking. See, the problem is if you're thinking about what you're writing, you can't write about what you're thinking. So if you're thinking about how to make the letters and how to form the letters or how to spell the words that you want to write, then you can't fluidly write those words. So when we write and we have mastered this, we pick up the pencil and we just start writing our thoughts. And we don't have any thoughts about how our hand is moving, and we typically don't have any thoughts about how to spell the words we're writing. So when you automate those components, you're looking at that practice screen. You've reduced frontal lobe functions for the graphomotor and spelling components. But as with the novel condition there, the third slide, you have to now come up with the thoughts that you want to put onto the page, and that's where the executive function components are involved now in terms of manipulating and holding those thoughts and organizing them and getting them out of your hand and onto the page. So while there is a slight reduction in executive demands, I mean, the most is when you don't know how to write, you don't know how to spell, and you're trying to get your thoughts out of your head. This is overwhelming. So we do want to try to automate as much as possible these basic components so that the executive functions are directing the production of the text rather than anything else. Of course, that has a lot of implications for early intervention and early education, in that we've got to automate those graphomotor functioning components. And you see here, just looking at the different components involved in graphomotor functioning, all those have to be coordinated as you are making your letters and forming your letters. Learning to do that and learning to do it to automaticity requires a great deal of executive control. But once you've automated that process, you do it pretty much with almost no thought, and therefore we've really reduced the executive demands on graphomotor functioning once it's been practiced. If your letter production looks like this, and you are in late kindergarten or first grade, we know we're in trouble in terms of where you are at this point. You haven't automated the orthographic or the graphomotor functioning part of this writing process now. It's going to be very difficult for you to get much further with writing. So you can see how we've really got to get this under control in kindergarten, first grade, so that we have got individuals that are at least producing something that may look like the next slide here. And even this, if you're producing this in first grade, by the end of first grade, if it takes you 30 seconds to produce these letters and they look like that, we have not yet fully automated the graphomotor functioning, and so we still are having a lot of struggling here in terms of getting the basic components down so that we can move on to the other components of writing. Of course, we expect very early for students to move into those components, even in kindergarten. So there's a big, I'm seeing a greater need for more systematic education in the graphomotor functioning components of writing early on, not as much as I see in some of the kindergarten classrooms that I'm in, especially with high-risk students. And this is important because we're preparing the frontal lobe to take on the rest of it, and performing this to a level of automaticity is also strengthening your self-regulation functions. And we can see later on when we're trying to do fluency, here's a student who has somewhat of a grasp of graphomotor function, not quite to the level that we would like to see it in terms of control, But you can see the loss of, in that second sentence there, just the loss of composition skills in terms of being very unclear about the ideas that are being presented. Now this next slide is that same student just almost 2 years later, and we can see that we're seeing much greater automaticity and much greater production. And so we're looking at 7 full minutes here from this individual. So the self-regulation components that were really weak with this individual back in November of 2010 have been strengthened greatly at this point, and we're seeing a greater level of control of the writing process, greater attention, and we're seeing greater production. So over time, we're going to see this in students where there's a good effort for remediation. We see improvements. The self-regulation executive functions that could be involved in writing. I have a very comprehensive model of executive functions that I talk about in other sources. Don't want to go over that here today because we're going to focus on the executive functions that are involved in writing. Those primarily would be the self-regulation executive functions that drive our system on a day-to-day basis and enable us to do specific acts within very short amounts of time. There are at least 33 of these that could be involved. You can imagine how each of these would be involved in a writing process. It's necessary for you to be able to use your sensory apparatus in order to write, thus to perceive, to focus your attention, to sustain your attention, to energize, which is to really bring appropriate amount of effort to the act of writing. Getting kids energized for the process of writing is a very difficult task. Some students will initiate, and getting started with the writing is initiating. Some kids resist the initiation, and we'll talk about why that's the case. A number of students seem to be resisting the initiation of writing, but what they're really telling you is that they have not been able to generate. And you can see that's in the middle column there. Fourth from the bottom is generate. They are unable to generate an idea. And if you don't have an idea to write, you are not going to start writing. So it's difficult at times to know whether this is an initiation problem or a generation problem. And often it is more of an initiation or a generation problem than an initiation problem. I think, let's see what the next slide is here. Okay, this transition. I'll just give you an example here. We're not going to have a lot of time at the end to talk about interventions, but in terms of what we've talked about so far and putting this all together in the writing process, we see that you have to have an idea. You have to generate an idea, turn it into language, take those words that you now have in your head. If you have automated transcription skills, then you can put those words from your head onto the page with your text generation using your text transcription skills, and then you can edit and revise those. In some situations, though, some students have a hard time doing that. And actually, a couple more slides later, we'll give an example here of what we're talking about there. Just here with the next 3 slides, I want to look at some of the other components here, the necessity of transitioning in the writing process to become much more self-initiated, self-sustained, self-monitored, self-disciplined. In other words, there's lots of executive control that's involved here in order for individuals to become effective writers. There's a lot of this that has to come under the control of the individual. There's only so much teaching that can be done. Then there's really a lot of frontal lobe maturation that has to occur and a lot of practice of the writing process in order for individuals to begin to own it themselves and to take charge of it. And this is the hardest part of writing. There's no question about that. So we know that it's not going to happen unless we've got a lot of good strategy instruction that occurs early. And unfortunately, that doesn't always take place, but it is necessary. And you can teach strategies, but this is without that teaching, it's not likely that we're going to become really good writers. We are waiting for maturation of the frontal lobes, that's true, but we have to have skill instruction that tells the frontal lobes what you want it to do in the writing process in order for us to become really good writers. A number of individuals now have the frontal lobe capacity to become writers, but because they've never been really introduced to strategies for how to write, they remain pretty poor writers. And, of course, the only way to become a good writer is to practice writing. And so if you avoid the task of writing, you are not strengthening and developing as effectively as you could the brain to do the writing process, and that creates a problem. So it's more the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in terms of writing. To become a good writer, you have to write a lot, and then it gradually over time becomes much more self-regulated. When you get into becoming a better writer. We get into middle school, high school, even into college. We're still really intermediate writers. Virginia Burning would suggest there are a few of us that are advanced or mature writers, even until well into adulthood. But at this point, we're looking at revising at the word and sentence level, and we see a focus from self-regulation to the higher level of writing components of really thinking about what you want to write and organizing it in your mind more effectively. And then we have, at the most advanced levels, the executive focus is really devoted to that self-regulation of those higher level components in a very much more integrated manner so that you can write more effectively, more quickly. And we've got a lot related to idea generation and pre-planning, which continue to develop, and we have the integration of reading and writing, which becomes more critical. To write well, the older you get, the more you have to read. The more you know, the more you can write. And so there's a real synergy there between reading and writing that has to occur. Now, there are many students that resist the writing process, and we think of them as these little evil geniuses that have their plans of how to conquer the world, and it doesn't involve writing. But the fact of the matter is, most students that resist the writing process are not little evil geniuses who have figured this all out. But they're really individuals that have trouble here. There's the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward center of the brain that really pulls you to focus and sustain energy and effort for the things that you like the most. Executive functions are tightly wired to the nucleus accumbens. Lots of neurons that connect those two, and so the executive functions kick in and say, you say, I want that, and your executive functions say, we can help you get that, no problem. So now you've got this internal command pathway going between the reward center and executive control that enables you to go after the things that you want the most, and that's intrinsic motivation for most of us. The problem, though, is we come over here to the upper right, and we have this external demand pathway. And external demand is where other people want you to use your executive functions to do something that they want you to do. And the problem there is that that's disconnected from your internal command pathway, your intrinsic motivation. The motivation for you to do it is that they're asking you to do it. Now, when it's teachers and parents, the solution for them is that you simply take your internal command right here, you take your reward center and just bring it over here and put it right here, because what we want from you is good for you too, and you should know that. That's a hard sell for most brains. It's difficult for individuals to just accept that the external demands that people are placing on them are the things that will satisfy their internal structures for reward. It's a lot easier in educational situations to take the external demand pathway and move it over here and place it above the internal reward center, so that you are convincing individuals that what you want them to do is what they like to do anyway. And there are curriculums, for example, tools of the mind, that frequently starts the educational process with, let's play a game, because everybody likes to play a game. So the minute you introduce the idea that we're going to play a game, you've got them hooked. Now, the idea here is that the internal command pathway is functioning effectively, and it doesn't even know that it's being commandeered by an external demand. And so now you've got a nice alignment of external demands and internal commands. And, of course, that's one of the major tenets of differentiated instruction, aligning external demands with internal desires. So we can see that that's the most effective way to go about this. But at some point, you're going to have to learn how to traverse this pathway of kind of moving from here and having your executive functions involved with what you want to coming over here, taking and responding to this pathway right here. So getting individuals to move from here to here and be able to respond to external demands, even if there's no good reason that they can see at the time, other than, well, maybe I'm just not seeing the importance of this right now, is very hard for brains to do. And, of course, the more you can help them see the underlying consequences of participating in what you want them to do, the positive benefits of that, the more likely you can get the brain to be engaged. And this is, in writing process, this is critical. So you're putting this all together. I have a student that was having trouble in class. He was resisting the writing process. He would refuse to write when the teacher asked him to. And so she asked me to talk with her a little bit about it and observe the child. And as we were talking, I explained the idea of external demands and internal commands and aligning the two of them. And so I go into observe, and today it's a writing exercise, and tell the students that they're going to have to write something about what they did in the summer, looking for at least 2 to 3 paragraphs with beginning, middles, and ends, and we're looking for something that was interesting that you did this summer. And so everyone picks up their pencils and starts writing, and Brett is sitting there with his arms crossed, and he's not writing, and the teacher comes over to him and says, Brett, I'd like you to write about what you did this summer. And he says, no. And she said, well, wasn't there anything you did this summer that was interesting and exciting and fun that you would like to tell us about? No. So she said, well, okay, you don't have to write about what we did this summer. Why don't you write about whatever you'd like to write about? Is there something you'd like to write about? And, of course, he said no. So she looked at me and kind of shrugged her shoulders like, I tried to align my external demands with his internal desires, but he doesn't have any internal desires right now. So that may well be true, but the other part is that he maybe doesn't have anything in his head about writing. And so I went over to Brett, and he's got an Eagles T-shirt on. This is in the Philadelphia area, and he's a big Eagles fan. And I said, do you like the Eagles? And he said, yes, I love the Eagles. And he's got a Donovan McNabb T-shirt on, and so we start talking about quarterbacks and the Eagles and Donovan McNabb, and he's getting all excited about it and telling me how great Donovan McNabb is and how good the Eagles are. And I said, well, they got a game on Sunday, don't they? Yes, they do. Who are they playing? They're playing the Giants. Oh, that's going to be a good game, The Giants have a good quarterback, too. Eli Manning's good, So we're going back and forth with quarterbacks and all this kind of stuff, and he's loving it. And then I said to him, well, you know a lot about football, don't you? He said, yes, I do. I said, well, we talked a lot about football. Why don't you just write about what we talked about football? And he just stopped for a minute, thought. He said, okay, picked up his pencil and started writing. So one of the things that we see with brains is that if there is no idea there, you can't really generate language if there's no idea. And the lack of initiation that we see and the refusal to initiate that we see from some students may simply be the fact that they do not have an idea. There is nothing in my head right now. I can't put words to something that's not there. Now, so if you walk them through that process, first, get them engaged, get them excited and emotionally engaged with an idea, get them to turn it into language, and now often the text transcription will follow. But if you don't get those processes in place, you're not going to see the production. Some students that will work with to a point, but the problem is not that they don't have the language representation in their head, or even once you put it there, the movement from the language in the head to the language through the hand, language by hand, to get it onto the page is very problematic for them. They have trouble with the text transcription process. So if it isn't automated and they're much older, we're looking at bypass strategies, keyboarding, texting, opposable thumbing, which is very effective for getting the job done if you have limited motor control. So we're looking at ways to help them with the transcription. What I've also found is that some students just need some warm-up. They need the brain to get into the writing process without all the demands placed on it. So we're looking at a warm-up of the graphomotor functioning processes in the brain before you put the demands for hold these ideas, manipulate them, think about them, and now start the graphomotor functioning. See, if you do that, it's kind of like starting a car engine cold, and you're not going to get out of the garage. So what I've got in those situations is I have students take topics that they like and that interest them, find material that they're reading on that, and copy some sentences from that material. Now, this isn't plagiarism. We're talking about copying for exercise, and you explain that to them. You don't claim these as your own. You're copying these to get your writing brain working and to practice the act of writing. Not only that, copying well-written sentences has a tremendous effect on appropriate use of grammar and syntax by writers because it's enabling them to listen to how good writers write, see how good writers write, and mimic that process. And the more you do that, the more the writer's voice that you develop begins to have a tone of other writers that you've experienced. And if you're copying lots of sentences from certain writers, you start writing like them. So this is a good process. It gets the hand warmed up, and you've avoided a lot of the executive demands and drains on earlier components so that they can now be focused on what they need to be focused on, which is holding and manipulating ideas and then getting them onto the page. The next slide that we see here then is one about finding that demand. What I've found in classroom situations is that there is just a demand for a writing product with nothing else stated. I want you to write about this. Or teachers go overboard and say, I want you to write about this, and here are all the ways I want you to write about it, and here's what I want in there, and they have such a long list of demands. Each of these demands for how I want you to write what I want you to write is a constraint on how you produce the writing product. And each constraint that you place on a brain for how to write increases executive function demands on that brain to make sure, how do I get this done the way you want me to get it done? Now, on the other end of that, with no guidelines, you're also placing not constraints, but you're placing great demands on executive functions to figure out what it is that should be done. If there are no guidelines there at all, some individuals have a really hard time using their executive functions to get a handle on that situation. So either of these ends of the continuum are not good. You're either overburdening the writer or you're giving them absolutely no guidelines. So the ideal here is a few guidelines with suggestions for specific writing strategies that can be used to complete the writing product. And now you're giving them some guidelines, but you're giving them the freedom to deal with it without too many constraints. So we've got situations where people have a hard time dealing with constraints in the writing process, even adults. So we're headed to Toronto for a vacation one summer. And this is a sign that we come across in a town. And my son looks at it and says, Dad, look at that sign. And I looked at the sign, and I'm in vacation mode. I'm not really thinking about this a whole lot. And it says, summer, time is oil, change time. And I'm thinking, wow, is that a haiku, or is this a Zen koan, something to reflect on? And it's a gas station. I'm thinking, wow, a Buddhist monk that runs a gas station. This is pretty cool. But of course, the person is trying to have a message here to deliver, and it's a gas station. They want to change your oil, right? Summertime is oil change time. But the problem is there are constraints. There's a sign so big and letters so big. And the idea is, how do you get the letters into the space? So you get your idea there. So it's a constraint on your expression of your ideas through orthography. And how well did this person do? The answer is not so well, right? Because some people would look at this and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. So the constraints we place on the writing process require executive functions to figure out how to beat them. And some of you may even have experienced this in your academic careers, where you've been given a box on a page after a question and said, it's an essay question, and put everything that you want to say about this essay question into the box. See, that creates an additional constraint on the writing process, in that now you have to think not just about the content you want to communicate to the person, but how much of it can you communicate in that box, and how big should you write? So it's interesting that those kinds of tasks then create greater demands on executive control of writing processes. So it's just the kind of thing we need to think about as we're requiring individuals to write. How many constraints should you be placing on the writing process? And how many guidelines should be offering them to enable them to overcome the constraints that you're placing? With good strategies, you can usually counteract that. But there's a balance between the two. In the Essentials of Executive Function Assessment, there are several rapid references in Chapter 6 that talk about the assessment of executive functions related to writing. And in 6.3, I've got a description of involvement of the stages of writing, and lists of executive functions most likely to be involved in that stage, and descriptions of the behavior. And they kind of look like this. This is the idea generation stage, and it talks about the cueing, directing, and coordinating of the generation of a topic and or ideas, or acceptance of the topic or ideas provided by an outside source. So in other words, can you generate an idea, or can you accept an idea that you've been given that you should write about? And you have to cue, direct, and coordinate mental processes in order to accomplish that. And so the executive functions likely to be used in doing that are energizing. Can you get yourself appropriately motivated and energized to take on the task? Can you focus your efforts, initiate, sustain? Engage is figure out the complexity. What's it going to take to get this job done? Being flexible, the willingness to accept other people's ideas or topics, or an idea or topic that's not exactly the one you'd like to do, but it's the best you can come up with at the time. Can you generate it? Can you associate ideas to come up with something to write about? Can you make decisions about what you want to write and how you want to write about it? Monitor as you write. Make corrections of anything that, monitor the idea generation process. Correct it if you think it's a bad idea. Can you generate a better one? And balancing would just be kind of finding a good balance between all of these components. So those are possible executive functions involved in that process. And there are a number of those 33 that you could be using at that time. The behavior indicating executive function difficulties in this stage would be a resistance, as we saw with Brett. Resistance to the idea generation or resistance to accepting topic of outside source. If you are resisting, I'm suspecting that there are some executive function difficulties that you're experiencing because you can't harness your writing skills to get the job done. So I'm going to be looking at the kind of things I did with Brett I may not be doing a complete diagnostic with you, but if I can walk you through the stages, if I can get you energized and excited about a topic and then you write, I'm definitely looking at executive function difficulties. And then the intervention here is how do I help students like Brett understand what's going on in their brains, why they were able to write at certain points, why they weren't able to write initially, and how they could overcome that. So with Brett, it was a discussion about, do you realize what I just did? How is it that you ended up writing? You wrote a lot on the Eagles here. This is great. I've got 4 paragraphs on the Eagles. This all makes sense. It's good. It's coherent. He's a 4th grader, and he's writing some pretty good stuff. But he had nothing initially. So I said, do you realize when you started you were saying, I don't want to write, I don't want to write. And this is what you wrote. So how did we get from I don't want to write to here? And we had to go back and think about it, right? I started asking you questions. I started talking with you about a topic that you liked. You got excited about it. You enjoyed it. You thought about things you could say. You said them. Once you had things you said, you could remember them and write them. So now this is what you're going to have to do when people say to you, I want you to write. This is what has to happen. You have to get an idea. You have to turn it into language. You have to get the language on the page. Now, if you're having trouble with those first steps, you might want to ask the teacher for some help. Could you talk with me about this? I don't have an idea. Could we talk a little bit to see what I can come up with? Maybe she could assign you another student that you could do that with. Or ideally, you could have that conversation in your own head. You could ask yourself these questions that I asked you, and you could possibly get just as excited about a topic as you did when you were talking with me. Sometimes the interaction is really still very, very necessary, but to become a self-regulated writer, it's going to have to happen inside the student's head at some point in time. So really explaining this and then teaching it and walking through it multiple times is how to get these strategies in place and how to get individuals to use them. But I didn't necessarily need to know which of the executive functions was problematic. It's just that I knew there probably was an executive function in here that was being difficult. Now, I may have seen some inflexibility, some resistance to certain ideas, and then I could hone in on that and figure out, okay, I see within the difficulties you're having that it's really not about initiation or about generation. It's about a lack of flexibility. See, so now the better you get at this, the more you can guide the discussion with a student based on what you know about the executive function that's problematic. The assessment of executive functions, if you're going to do this with tests, there's a concept here in the book that I'm describing called cascading production decrements. The idea here is that all those different processes, abilities, skills, lexicons, those are all necessary for writing. If you don't have them, you can't write well. So if you're looking for deficits in processes or abilities or skills, then you want to assess them. And if you find that the skills are okay, but you're still not getting the production you're looking for, then this cascading production enables you to take that skill or ability or lexicon and assess it without many executive function demands, and you see pretty good performance, and then take that same skill or process or ability and add some executive function demands and see what happens to production. And if the more executive functions you add, the worse the production gets. You have a cascading production decrement, which means the problem is not the skill or ability or lexicon itself. It's the executive direction of it or engagement with it. And when the more executive demands are placed on the individual to use that skill, the more you see a deterioration of this use of that skill. And in writing, this really happens a lot. So what we see here so it's the process. Identifying specific capacity that you want to assess it, then select the measure that has executive functions, and see what happens. And there are some here that I'm going to show you. If you're using the PAL-2, just a basic alphabet writing task. If you can produce the letters of the alphabet, and I see that your graphomotor functioning has been automated to a great degree, then I give you PAL-2 copying A, and you fall apart and can't do it very well. I know you can write the letters in order and produce them out of your own head. So copying A should not be that much of a challenge for you. If I see a cascading production decrement here from writing, alphabet writing to copy A to copy B, I'm likely looking at executive demands being too much for you. You're getting overwhelmed with the process, and you can't maintain the use of the graphomotor functioning that I know you have. So these are the kinds of ways we're looking here for these cascades, and we're looking for statistically significant differences here, and reliably significant differences. So I'm using a rule of thumb of at least one standard deviation difference between the scores on the baseline and the scores on the baseline plus executive functions. Here we have one again. I see an individual performing well with alphabet writing and with copying A and B, but then when it's time to do sentence composition or PAL 2 sentence writing, we're not seeing the production here. And then with Y3 with essay composition, we see almost nothing. And so now, when we know that the basic graphomotor functions are there and copying is adequate and those can be performed, when you struggle with the other components, there are likely components related to executive production that are getting in the way. Let's see if we have another one here. Yeah, this is copy A and B and sentence composition on the Y3, but essay composition is problematic. And then you look at expository note-taking and report writing with the PAL 2, and those are problematic as well. We're looking at the inability to cue, direct, and coordinate the writing skills that I know you have. If you can compose sentences, if you can copy, if you know the alphabet, see if all those components are there, essay composition, there's something about essay composition you don't know. Now, it may be that the skill is missing and you just don't know how to write essays. But in many of these situations, it's not the skill of writing an essay that's the problem. It's the coordination of the components necessary to write the essay, which is more an executive function problem. When you use strategy instruction, you're often not teaching the components, the individual components being used in the writing process. You're really teaching a way to combine them and integrate them and organize them. And that's really an executive function component. Writing more than any other skill that we learn in school really is, there's so much saturation of executive functions throughout the process that strategy instruction is really required in order for us to get where we want to get to with students. So in the Essentials of Executive Function Assessment, Rapid Reference 6.6 provides a list of these baseline executive function minimized, EF minimized tasks. In other words, tasks that have a minimal executive function demand that you can use as a baseline for abilities, skills, lexicons, processes, and functions. And then it also gives a list of related executive functions saturated, or tasks that involve a lot of executive control of those particular processes. And so those are listed there for you in terms of the ones that you can apply for written expression assessment. In Essentials of Executive Function Assessment in Rapid Reference 6.8, there are examples provided in that rapid reference to illustrate how to identify written expression production decrements likely to be resulting from ineffective engagement of executive functions. So you're going to get a better sense of this in a narrative form within this rapid reference. It kind of looks like this. It's small. I apologize for that, but on your computer screens, it's certainly easily read. In Essentials of Executive Function Assessment 6.8, this is a discussion when we're talking about how to use semantic fluency tasks to understand language generation within the mind before you get to the stage of actually writing it. How much can you produce in the way of language in your head? And so we're looking at the use of things like semantic fluency tasks. And when I see that you have good control of semantic fluency, but your letter fluency is poor, that suggests that there's an executive function difficulty there. And it just kind of goes through that in more detail, shows you the kind of cascades that you would get. The narrative rationale for why you're doing these cascades and how you're doing them and what you're looking at is provided there in that rapid reference. This is a rapid reference 613 out of the Essentials book, and it shows you here different assessments of writing. And this is just an excerpt. The list is much longer in terms of the stages and the different writing assessments. And then it provides you, on the far right, our process or observations of writing behavior likely to indicate a lack of executive function use. And then in the middle column is the number of the observation that you are most likely to see with certain tasks. So you can see that for a number of them, there are a lot of observations that would go along. The more complicated the writing process, the more things could go wrong with it, the more things you have to look at. This is the real problem with writing is that, it's integrating all these processes at one time. In order to really understand what the problem is, you've got to pull it apart, look at all these processes, abilities, skills, lexicons separately. Can you perform them? Are you effective with these? And now, what about integrating them? How are you with integrating them? So that's the executive function piece that we're talking about here. Not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it's certainly manageable and doable. I think that there is a second handout posted in addition to the PowerPoint that is a Word file that gives you a process-oriented write-up of a writing skills assessment, executive function assessment of writing skills. That is many paragraphs long that I had done with a young child in first grade. You can take a look at that and see how I'm trying to pull these components apart and look at the whole process. And that's actually in Rapid Reference 6.16, the case study report section. Describes a process-oriented assessment of executive function difficulties affecting written expression. I believe that is excerpted, and it's in a handout for you that was posted along with the PowerPoint. And so we're process-oriented approach. I'm using quite a bit. There are multiple ways to use the process-oriented approach. One of them that I use frequently is that I need more information. In other words, what I see you doing, how you do the task, is as important as the score that you get. And this is what one student wrote for me for my favorite game is off of the when the Y2 was being used. This is a student that I was testing with it, and this is what he wrote. Not very good for a 9-year-old. Doesn't spell well. Has difficulty with spacing and putting all the information on the page. So I know there's some transcription difficulties here. Not real well automated with the writing process. Spelling is getting in the way too. So I'm going to score this, and you're getting a poor score with it. But then a process approach says, well, I still need to know how you're doing this, and I need to know the stages in writing that you engage to get here. Now, I gave you the idea, so there's no idea generation. It's take my idea, my favorite game is, and now turn that into language. Now, can he turn this into language? The next slide will show you that. Basically, what I do after I have them write the paragraph is, if it looks like this, I just say to them, tell me about what you wanted to write. I can see what you wrote here, but I'm wondering if that's maybe there's more here that you wanted to write about. So could you just tell me what you were thinking about your favorite game and tell me about it? And so this is what I got Evan to tell me. My favorite game is rolling marbles. I think it's fun. I learned it yesterday. It can be pretty hard at times, right? And so we got this. I like making boxes to roll marbles into. I look at this with this. You probably need to be pretty skilled with eye-hand coordination to do it. Okay, so there's a lot more language representation in this kid's head than what got onto the page. And so now I'm getting to the point where I'm saying, okay, I can see that this isn't a language problem per se or a working memory problem in holding the information in mind as far as the language produced. How do you get it from your head onto the page? Does the working memory component deteriorate as you pick up the pencil and start to write? Do you now forget the words and the ideas? Or are they still there, but you still just can't get them on the page the way you want? And, of course, it's interesting that in this whole process, we look at text generation and we score that. We don't know about language representation. We don't even ask about idea generation. We move right to text generation. We're not sure about text transcription unless you have a task to do it. And then we never do editing and revising. Everything that we do in composition writing with the Y at 3 or any of the other tests that we have that ask students to do this, for the most part, it's the first draft that we're scoring. And in the writing process, a critical component of good writing is always fixing up what you write. It's never right the first time. The sentences that come out of your head as if you were speaking them are not the way they're going to look once you write them and the writing is finalized. So that's a hard thing for some kids to grasp and understand, that you really have to kind of, get to the point of editing and revising the things that you do right. They're not necessarily just good. So we don't assess that. We don't look at it. So I think it's interesting the disconnect between the way we assess writing and even the way we try to assess the executive function involvements in writing and the actual stages in the writing process from a neurodevelopmental perspective, how they occur in the brain, and how we use them. So there's a lot of room here for improvement, unquestionably, in the processes and how we do it and the tests that we use. I like this statement from Bernier on page 248 of her brain literacy for educators and psychologists. While it's true that brain maturation, over time, brains get more capable of writing, the neural networks required are maturing. But of course, the interconnectivity of those networks depends on you actually practicing the act of writing. There's a potential for coordinating these neural networks in the brain, but if you don't write, you aren't connecting them. So in order to become a better writer, you have to write. There's no question about that. And if you're not learning how to write with some strategies, then you're not practicing good writing. You're not wiring the brain effectively to become a good writer. So really there's a lot of instruction that has to occur, much more than what typically does occur. I don't know about you, but reflecting on my background in education, I was not taught to write. Writing was demanded of me. You will write and you will write well. If that's not good, write more. No, write better. That was the feedback that I got. So that's not a strategy. That's not a strategy approach to teaching writing. And by the time you get to middle school and high school, much of the writing instruction, even if you were taught some strategy in elementary today, most of the writing instruction at that point becomes Olympic judging. It's simply saying, okay, that's good, that sucks, still sucking. Okay, so that's the feedback. I told him it was bad writing. He had to fix it up. Well, how do you fix it up? What strategies do you use to fix up? What strategies do you use to generate it in the first place? See, without some good instruction in that, many individuals are going to flounder with the writing process. I have a number of graduate students that I teach that really have really not learned how to write, and they haven't learned how to edit what they do write. So it's still an educational process for most of us well into college and graduate school. Learning how to write and learning how to write well is something that we usually aren't taught. It could be taught. It could be taught better. There are a number of programs that do. The best summary of that right now is Writing Instruction That Works. Best Practices in Writing Instruction. It's a book by, I believe that Graham and other authors have written that. I don't have a slide on it. I'm sorry about that. But it's a good book to look at. It's called Best Practices in Writing Instruction. It basically summarizes a lot of the work that Graham and Harris have done over the years in self-regulated strategy development, SRSD, self-regulated strategy development, how to help brains develop strategies for becoming good writers. And it's evidence-based. We've been looking at this since the 80s and into the 90s. In the 2000s about how to teach writing and how to teach effectively. And these are really good strategies because they incorporate the things that we're talking about with cueing and coordinating and directing and learning how to do that with your brain, essentially strengthening the executive functions that are necessary to learn how to write. Many executive function difficulties related to writing are the result of a lack of adequate maturation neural networks. That's fair enough. They are. But you've got to have that strategy instruction. And the most effective form of intervention is to write, and to write, and then have that be increasingly more guided by the use of self-regulation strategies. So this is the task. There is no way around it. There are things that people try to do to prepare the brain, but the fact of the matter is, in this case, it's got to be writing that you have to do. This is a summary of that strategy that I mentioned about what Virginia Berninger uses with kindergarten students, and it can be used beyond that. What I think I can say, what I can say I can write, and I would add what I can write I can fix up, because you've got to get that editing, revising stage in there. Even when you're younger, it's good to be working on correcting your invented spellings and learning how to spell the words correctly, and form the letters correctly. So everything is what I think I can say, what I say I can write, what I write I can fix up. There's always room for improvement, and so let's just get used to doing that all the time. Okay, so that's a summary of one of those strategies. Okay, here is a strategy here, the 5-stage strategy instruction. This is just a general outline of what you would do with strategy instruction. And it involves explaining the purpose to the student, what you're going to teach and how you're going to teach it. You model the use of that strategy. You have the student memorize the steps in the strategy. You support their implementation of the strategy by scaffolding as you do it. They do it. You help them do it. You show them the stages, the steps. You give them feedback about the accuracy of their performance. multiple run-throughs of the strategy and the use of the strategy as examples. And then the final stage, we're looking for the student to independently apply the self-regulated strategy covertly in their own minds. You've been modeling it. Here's what you should say to yourself in this stage. So, this is where you want to get them to be, that final stage. And those are the stages of strategy instruction. Now, I also then included this very last slide. If you want to blow that up and print it and reproduce it, there's no information on it whatsoever. And boy darn, I wish I would have tagged it at least in some way. This was provided to me by Lori Lennon, and Lori and her colleagues are using this in the Central Bucks School District. I asked her if anyone should be recognized for the development of it, and she didn't have anyone in particular that she wanted to acknowledge, but it's from Central Bucks School District, and it's from Lori Lennon. I will send a copy of this to Andrea. It could be posted for later webs or something like that with some information about that, because I'd rather, if you're going to use it and lift it, I'd rather it be acknowledged where you got it from. But it's just a kid-friendly writing rubric that gives them some idea of the kinds of areas you'd be looking at. We talked about constraints on writing and the things that you want them to have in their writing. Having rubrics like this is sort of that center balance section there. Where here are the kind of things that we want you to have in your writing, and here's a way to kind of evaluate where you are with that. Okay, I think we're doing well with time. And Andrea, I don't know, at this point, would you like to switch over to questions and answers?
Sure, we can do that. I've got several here for you.
Okay.
Perfect. So Paul wants to know on your cascading slides, and I think that was back on slide 40.
Okay.
On the cascading production decrement, is there a formula for the working memory score versus the amount of executive function demand you can use to determine the amount of executive function demand you can place based on the working memory score or the executive functioning score on the brief or the WJ3?
Okay. Well, there's a couple things there. I think with the brief, I would take that off the table because there are observations of parents and teachers, and the statements in the working memory scale are about doesn't follow can do when given three things to do, only remembers the first or the last. There are a number of statements that even those are very global, and it's hard to know exactly what if they get an off and on that, what the problem underlying that really is. So I often have to dig a little deeper, even when I'm using the brief. I've got to qualify that a lot. When using the WJ, tasks like story recall or understanding directions that are telling you about the extent to which the individual can hold information in their mind and then retell a story. That would be a story recall, and I think, for example, children memory scale stories and the Ramble has a stories recall on it. When you're using those kinds of tasks, you're asking the individual to hold information in working memory, maintain an organizational thread to it, and then retell the story to you. Now, one of the pieces there is the language by mouth is not the same as language by hand. So ideally, we should have a norm-referenced version of that task where you listen to the story and then you write what you heard. Now, the PAL2 note-taking is similar to that, but there you take notes, and then you write from your notes. See, so we still don't quite have a task that looks exactly at what we want to know, which is, can you hold information and can you get it out of your pencil? That would be ideal. Now, then the question would be, is that executive coordination or is that working memory? So then we'd have to break it down and say, okay, how can we make this a simple working memory task that doesn't involve a lot of executive direction of working memory? And how do we complicate it and make it one where you've got to really use a lot of executive functions, even though you just have to use a little bit of working memory? I'll tell you what, right now I can't think of a task that really does that, but if I went back and looked at all the tasks that we have, I might be able to come up with something close to that. But you can see what we're talking about here, how the things that we need to do in assessment, we don't necessarily have the tools to do because test development doesn't necessarily think about it from the perspective of what do we need to pull apart to diagnose and analyze and understand problems. We get handed tasks that look cool and they're fun to do and they've been normed. And then we have to figure out, okay, how can we use this to do our diagnostics? So it's the process right now is not being driven by the diagnostics, it's being driven by what we're given. And So I don't really have a good answer to that one at this point. Hopefully the things that I just said will kind of make some, turn some wheels there, and maybe some people can come up with something. I'd love to hear from anyone at my email address if you come up with something on your own. If I think of something, maybe, I could send it to you if you email me. Okay? Thank you. That's a good question.
Thanks, Dr. McCloskey. So Marilyn asks, what are the brain differences and outcome differences between handwriting and typing for novel idea writing?
It depends. You're using the motor cortex, and so the motor movements that you make with your hands are imprinted on the motor cortex. The more you make those motor movements, the more automated they become on the motor cortex, the easier to access it and produce it motorically. If you're really struggling with handwriting and you can't get what Laurie would call the kinetic melodies of handwriting, right? How you form each of the letters, how your hand moves to make them. If you really struggle with all those movements that you have to learn to make 52 characters, 26 uppercase, 26 lowercase, right, and then get into the variations of those, and then with cursive, if that's too much for your hand, appreciate that the only motor movements you have to make when you're pushing a keyboard is to just tap your fingers, all 10 of them, just an up and down movement. So the actual motor movements you need to make to type are much simpler than the ones you need to handwrite. A visual spatial component is added to find the keys on the keyboard. So there's a visual integration with that graphomotor, with that very simple motor pushing. So now it becomes more visual spatial than graphomotor. And some individuals are much better at finding the keys and pressing them much more effectively than creating all those coordinating all those motor movements to create those kinetic melodies. So for a person like that, there's no question that keyboarding is going to be better than graphomotor production. Now, at early ages, you try to get them to do the graphomotor production, but if by second, third grade we're not seeing that happen, then you give them a keyboard and see what happens. The idea that you can only deep process language by handwriting, I think, is a faulty assumption. You deep process whatever you automate in the motor cortex most effectively at the youngest ages. That's kind of your default. So I learned how to handwrite with pencils and pens, and I'm left-handed, and that didn't go as well as you might expect, of course. But when I get stuck in writing, I keyboard all the time now. I never want to pick up a pencil because I've reprogrammed my motor cortex to just move my hands. But when I have to pick up a pen, sometimes I get stuck in the process of idea generation and thinking, and I've got ideas, and I want to get them organized in some way, and I want to write them down. And so I pick up a pencil and I start writing by hand, but I find myself dropping the pencil as quickly as possible and getting back on a computer and either drawing a diagram, and I draw a diagram by hand, but doing something on the computer or typing on the computer because it's my preferred mode for my motor cortex. When you get stuck, you default to the strategy that you learned first. But if you are 2 years old and you've been tapping on a keyboard since age 2, that's how you're programming your motor cortex from the start, and it's your default position. It's what you want to go back to. So that will be deep processing for the next generation, and it may just be opposable thumbing. The idea that you have to go back to handwriting to really connect to words and really understand them and know what you're doing, that's true for my generation. I'm not so true for new brains. Maybe it is, but I'm just wondering. At this point, I don't think that's the case because there are just as many people who are effective with keyboard writing as they are with handwriting. And we're not telling handwriters to go back to the hammer and chisel. That's how we started. And you really don't get deep processing till you pick up that hammer and really smack the stone with that. And, we've progressed with what we do with our hands in writing. And I think, interestingly, the next stage is probably just thinking it and it appears on the screen. And that'll be a great accommodation for people who can't use their hands at all to write.
Thank you, Dr. McCloskey. We have a couple of things. Is the same, relating back to your cascading slides, is the same cascading process applicable when working with children who have difficulty with cursive handwriting?
Yes, it is, and because again, that's a system you're trying to automate, and if you haven't automated the cursive writing system, and I would say you can. Now they're not normed that way. But you could certainly do an adapted version of it and have them handwrite copying A and copying B from cursive, and see how they do with that, and just have them do the cursive letters of the alphabet. And if they can't produce those, if they don't even know them and can't produce them, you're dealing with a graphomotor functioning difficulty that hasn't been automated. And if they can't copy them effectively within a reasonable amount of time, you're dealing with some problems there. So I think that we can adapt what we have, but again, the tests that we have aren't always providing us with the information that we need to do the best of diagnostics.
Thanks. A couple of similar questions here. Sharona asks if you have any suggestions on how to manage when there is both skill or knowledge deficits and executive functioning weaknesses.
Yeah, well, there's, you kind of have to work on both at the same time. This is what we're really thinking about balanced literacy here, and we talk about it a lot with reading, but we need to talk about it with writing too. Language experience and knowledge acquisition and vocabulary development and strengthening all those components through discussion, through classroom discussion. The more a person knows, the more they're going to write. And so if you don't know much, you won't be writing much. And so strengthening that through various ways to get more information loaded into those lexicons is going to be critical. But at the same time, you do have to be working the hand to write, or the hands if you're going to be typing or texting. You do have to be working on that system, and so you say, well, okay, we're going to reduce the content demands and get some writing out of you. So I would say that what we want to do there is when you've got students that don't have much in the way of background knowledge or vocabulary, we're going to reduce the rubric on the demands for those and increase the rubric on the demands for writing and say, okay, I'm just looking for you to move your hand and get thoughts out of your head and create sentences. And if they're good sentences and they make sense, but they don't communicate a lot of content, I understand, because you don't have a lot of content. So you want to kind of dissociate the grading of those two components as much as possible so that you don't discourage individuals from becoming the writers that you want them to be. But acknowledging that, eventually to be a really mature writer, you got to have all these components effectively developed. But in many kids, they're very unevenly developed, and balanced literacy would suggest you've got to educate all aspects of this process in the brain. If you're going to get good writing, you can't just ignore the fact that they don't know any vocabulary, they don't have much in the way of background knowledge. That has to be built.
Thank you. And Shamara asks if you have any resources on teaching self-regulation to junior high students. I don't have any specific, nothing comes to mind right now, although I shouldn't say it. Lynn Meltzer's work in promoting executive functions in the classroom. She talks about how she's doing that with students from 4th to 8th grades. She also has a program called Essay Express and Brain Cogs, Brain COGS, Brain Cogs. These are software programs that she has that she uses in sync with the things that she describes in the book to help students develop more in the way of what we would consider to be self-regulation, or what really would be good study skills. So a lot of good study skills curriculums often have these things embedded in them. It's really funny, though, when I think back that some of the techniques and practices that went out of went out of favor very early. When I was younger, one of the things that we frequently had to do was to write a sentence 100 times, right? I will not do that. I will not do whatever it was. And you think about that. Some of your most executively dysregulated kids were the ones that were always getting in trouble. And by making them sit down and write for a long period of time, repetitively, you were actually strengthening the self-regulation capacities of the writing system by making them do that. Not a bad idea when you think about it. So, some of the things that we used to do actually had some we think, that was just ridiculous, but in fact, maybe not so much so. Dr. McCloskey, can you repeat that resource as well as the author?
Yeah, the resource, Lynn Meltzer, M-E-L-T-Z-E-R, M-E-L-T-Z-E-R, Meltzer. Lynn is her first name. And the book that she has out is called Promoting Executive Functions in the Classroom. And the software is Essay Express and Brain Cogs. Relatively inexpensive to purchase.
Thank you. Alicia commented on the slide that's displaying right now with the nucleus accumbens, and she commented that it seems like this relates to all learning, not just written expression. Can you comment?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. This is a slide that I use generally in talking about the disconnect between production or producing disabilities and learning disabilities, that there are a number of students that just have producing disabilities, and that these pathways we're looking at here, the ability to respond on demand when people want them to, is lacking. And it's lacking in writing. It could be lacking in reading. Could be lacking in math, or many other areas. So it is the basis of the producing difficulties that we see when executive functions are involved. And many students just don't know how to get their executive functions online to respond to the external demands. Now, when they learn that, they will then respond. A number of them, it's not that they want to be oppositional or resist. They have no idea how to get their brains there. Even the best trained athletes in the world don't know how to get their brains there at times. On-demand production, I want to see your best efforts when I tell you you need to have your best efforts. The game is today. You have to run that race today at 10 a.m. I've seen you break the world record before, but you have to. If you don't run it well this morning at 10 a.m., you could finish in 10th place instead of in first. And you think he's unmotivated, doesn't want to do it, you could do it if you wanted to. I've seen you break the world record. You could do it if you wanted to. No, it's even for the best athletes, best trained athletes, the idea of external demand and getting your executive functions online to run your show as effectively as possible when other people want you to do it instead of when you feel like doing it is the most difficult thing in the world for any of us. Some of us have a little bit easier time of it than others. If you're executively deficient, this is a killer.
Dr. McCloskey, is this particular slide available in your Essentials book?
Not yet. I put this together for workshops that I do. And, as I said, I apologize for the feature that we couldn't use today, which is that, the animation where you bring pieces in one at a time. I have this slide in the animated source. It's a little easier to understand and walk through when I do that. And there's some motions here, too, that occur. But if you email me, I would certainly be willing to share this with you. I have no problem with sharing this kind of information. It's just that I don't like to put it just into PowerPoints because I like to at least talk with people and know who's taking it and using it. And, so I would be willing to share it if someone emailed me.
Okay, thanks. I'll go ahead and post your email again in the chat box, everyone. Dr. McCloskey, we have a lot of people commenting on or asking about the omission of handwriting from elementary school curriculum, and kind of this same question is coming in different formats. Can you comment? Yeah,
it's really a real problem. I think it's a real problem. We're moving. It's that whole. You get to this idea with whole language and with decoding approaches, they tend to be more detailed and bottom up, and whole language tends to be top down and focus on the lexicons and the abilities and putting everything together. It's the same thing in writing. The more we focus on, and even Tools of the Mind, which is a absolutely tremendous curriculum. I think anyone that has opportunity to use Tools of the Mind, Elena Bedrova's curriculum for preschool and kindergarten, to teach preschool and kindergarten students greater self-regulation, to improve their self-regulation. It's a tremendous curriculum, and they have a good way of scaffolding the writing process. But once the writing process is scaffolded, there isn't much in their manuals about the idea of practicing that automaticity of graphomotor function, which does have to be done on a regular basis for it to become automated and to stay automated. So I do see a lack of that in curriculums. In fact, I see a lack of just systematic training and teaching of the formation of the letters in the first place, and then a total lack of any practice of automaticity for the production of the alphabet. And Virginia Bernier talks a lot about that in her book and the justification and the need for that within kindergarten, even early into first grade and through first grade, that's the major component of the writing process is automating. Now, putting it all together, getting thoughts, getting them out of and communicating them, all that's important to do in balanced literacy at early grades. But just as phonological awareness and decoding are important in reading at early grades, so is graphomotor production in terms of writing. So we've gotten way too far away from that. But again, there are a number of kids that come from homes now who have been keyboarding. And if keyboarding isn't available to them, for some of those brains, it's a step backwards for them to pick up a pencil or a pen or a crayon and start making letters in print or cursive, because they're already hardwired in terms of their motor cortex production and visual spatially to find the letters on the keyboard and press them. And, that's the future. And I think it's kind of a bait and switch we do on kids when we make them practice handwriting for 6 to 7 years, and then suddenly in middle school say, oh, stop that. you're going to have to type everything now. Oh, we didn't teach you how to type? Never mind. Start typing, because that's what we're going to want from you in education from now on. That's what anybody's going to want from you in all of the, in every job that you hold. Nobody's going to ask you to write. They don't want to read your chicken scratch. It could get confusing. They want a clear, concise, visual frame that they can look at, which usually comes from typing. So there's a lot of things we need to work out here in early education about, is handwriting critical for expression of thoughts through the hand? Is that critical? Or can we just go to keyboarding? And at this point, the studies that I've seen, which are not many, would suggest that maybe we don't have to go to the handwriting part at all. Maybe we could go right to the keyboarding. But that's what you're going to have to do later. So it's really interesting that we train the brain to do one thing and then switch to do another thing. Are we sure that the connection is necessary? I don't know. I know my kids, did not do a lot of. We prepared them at the home, so when they got to school, pencils, pens, crayons, keyboards, it didn't matter. They were flexible enough to pick up any and use them, but certainly the preferred mode has always been keyboard and remains keyboard.
Dr. McCloskey, do you have some information or resources on how to address external versus internal demands, and then maybe something that suggests strategies on helping intrinsic motivation?
I like everything that the Tools of the Mind curriculum does in that area by making kids think about it as games. How masterful that is, how well it's done. You could adapt that and use it all the way through the curriculum. Just the idea that I'm engaging you in a positive way so that you're thinking about this task as something that could potentially be fun instead of it's really a lot of hard work. Well, you may be doing a lot of hard work, but it's also fun. So let's start with the fun part, and we'll get you working before you know it. I've been reading Daniel Pink's book called Drive, D-R-I-V-E, Drive, where it's a book on motivation. And he discusses the extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic, and of course intrinsic being the strongest and the best way to go for anything. But there are tasks for which people just aren't motivated, and you do have to kind of reward or punish for those kinds of tasks. So he talks a lot about that and how to get that done. But he also mentions in there what he calls the Sawyer effect, S-A-W-Y-E-R, as in Tom Sawyer, the idea of, having to whitewash a fence, which was really a task he didn't want to do, but then convincing his friends that it was really a lot of fun and wouldn't let them do it. No, you can't do this. It's just too much for you. And basically they begged him to let them do his work for him because it became so intrinsically motivating to them to do it. So this is what Tools of the Mind does. It's a Sawyer effect. It takes the kids and says, I don't know, it's a game. You sure you want to play this? Yes, we want to play that, yes. And so you've got them in situations where they're all lined up to transition from a classroom, and they're standing there, stock still and not moving at all. And I say to them, what are you doing? They say, we're playing a game. We're playing Buckingham Palace Guard. And I thought, wow, that's creative. The last thing kids want to do is line up and stay still, but they're all playing this game. And so you see that you can engage the brain playfully and get more accomplished than if you tell them it's a lot of hard work. And the playful part usually taps into the intrinsic motivation components faster and easier. But there are interesting things about reward systems and reward structures too that they kind of point out in that book. So if you get a chance to read Drive, I think it's a good place to start. It's a popular press discussion, but it leads to a deeper understanding or appreciation of where you need to go in the brain to understand things like the nucleus accumbens and what happens if that's so greatly tied to rewards and addiction. Is it good to keep trying to light it up in reward systems? Because then the rewards start losing their potency and you need more of them to keep the individual engaged and interested. And that's even if it's a positive thing, not necessarily an addiction. So it's certainly much better verbal praise, stepping back to just verbal praise, and then trying to get the individual internally motivated, intrinsically motivated to do it. And those are the discussions that we often have with kids, and we say, I don't get it. This kid just isn't motivated for anything. And that's the toughest challenge that we face with kids. Not that they don't have executive functions, that they're not even engaging them because they don't have the spark or the motivation or the drive to even want to engage them. And how do you convince that brain that they should, that it would be good for them in the long run if they did that? That's the discussion I have with lots of kids. And sometimes it can be productive and sometimes not so much so.
Thanks, Dr. McCloskey. And that the Drive author was Daniel?
Daniel Pink, P-I-N-K.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Al asks if there are any differences between script or cursive for building automaticity.
For most writers, cursive tends to be a much easier system to master and to use. For some individuals, though, cursive seems to be easier. So it's, even though we teach print first and then cursive, some people have told me, and I have seen a few students for whom cursive has been easier to pick up and easier to use. So, the tendency is to teach print first and then teach cursive. But sometimes if students begin to struggle with print, we go right to keyboard. You might want to just introduce cursive and see what happens. And if it starts picking up and you want to automate that as a graphomotor production, then you can use that. And I'm trying to be conservative here in these approaches and saying, try to make the student use their hand graphomotorically to do what they need to do to get the handwriting process mastered. But don't spend so much time attempting to do that and for such a long period of time that you stifle the individual's capacity to become a writer. If we stay at that graphomotor component and we work away at it and it's not happening, we need to consider options for moving forward in the writing process because it's holarchical in nature. We can get by this. So then you say, okay, well, let's introduce the cursive, see what happens. Give that a while. That didn't happen either. Okay, let's move on to keyboarding and see what happens. So I wouldn't just immediately jump to keyboarding necessarily with any child, but there are going to be children for whom keyboarding will be the answer when they can't do either. And for some children, cursive may be the answer when they can't print.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit about the differences between ADHD and executive functioning deficits?
Yeah, ADHD is actually a subset of the 33 that you saw there. So any individual with ADHD guaranteed has, if they have inattention, they have focus and sustain. Of those 33, focus and sustain is problematic for them. If they have hyperactivity, then inhibit, impulse control is difficulty, but also modulation, which is adjusting the intensity. More ADHD kids have trouble adjusting the intensity of their reactions to things than they do with inhibition. In other words, you tell them to walk, they run. You tell them they can talk, they yell. Wherever the line is drawn, they're always over it. This is a big problem with ADHD, modulation and inhibit. So if you are ADHD, those four will be problematic for you. There's no question about that, okay? Then any given person with ADHD probably has a number of these other 33 that are problematic. So the core constellation of ADHD is focus, sustain, modulate, and inhibit, and often stop is included there too. But those given, if you have those in spades, you'll get high ratings on an ADHD rating scale, and you'll be classified as ADHD if everybody thinks those are your problems. But then the constellation of executive function difficulties any ADHD individual exhibits is greater than those 4 or 5. But they're different for any ADHD individual. So which of these 33 is your problem? I know 4 of them are. What other ones are also there? And usually medication will address the difficulties with sustaining and focus and modulating and inhibiting to some degree. You'll see effective medication on those. You'll get lower ratings in those areas, but not necessarily in other ratings. So then the behavior management has to address the other executive functions of the 33 that are still problematic for a student with ADHD. And they could have, anywhere from 4 to 33 that are problematic and in different combinations. So that's why I look at all of these when I'm doing an ADHD evaluation, because I'm not making an assumption that you only have a few of them that are problematic. And I need to sort this all out.
Thanks, Dr. McCloskey. And everyone, we've reached the end of our time here today, and I wanted to let you know that Dr. McCloskey will be back with us a little later in the spring, and you can register for those sessions at the address that I posted in the chat box. It's psycor.com/CE webinars. I can't thank you enough, Dr. McCloskey. Would you like to share some final thoughts as we close out today?
Well, first, you're very welcome. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion, and I think it's great that so many people are tuning in and listening. And and thinking about these issues, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this information out there so that it can be discussed. And please feel free to email me with questions. I'll do my best, although I am inundated with emails. So my adage that I always use with my clients with executive function difficulties who say, is this going to be forever? Am I going to be like this forever? The answer is not forever, just longer than you'd like. And so in my responses to emails, it's usually not forever, but longer than you'd like in me getting back to you. But I do appreciate hearing from people. I enjoy the opportunity to have dialogue about these kind of issues. And thanks you all for tuning in. I hope to see you for the reading and for the math webinars that we do later.
Thank you again.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect from the webinar.